Russia has just launched the deadliest aerial attack of this year on Ukraine. Overnight into April 16th, Russia unleashed what Reuters described as the deadliest strike wave of the year so far, hitting multiple cities and leaving at least 17 people dead and more than 100 wounded. But Ukraine says it still intercepted about 95% of it. So how did this attack still become the deadliest strike wave of the year? Let's break it down. To begin with, this attack wasn't carried out in one single strike. Ukraine's Air Force described it as waves of combined attacks, using a mix of ground-launched and air-launched missiles alongside a heavy flood of attack drones. Across that 24-hour window, Ukraine said its radars detected 703 aerial targets coming in from Russia. The bulk of that number was mainly drones. AP News described the assault as nearly 700 drones backed by ballistic and cruise missiles. That mix matters because it's not just more weapons, it's a layered problem for Ukraine. Drones to force constant tracking and constant decisions, and missiles to punch through at the moments that matter. Moreover, Russia didn't concentrate this in one place. It spread the strike across the country's most important population and logistics centers. Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, was hit hard. Odessa, one of the key southern port cities, took deadly damage. Dnipro was struck again, and officials reported injuries from drone strikes in Kharkiv. This attack wasn't just about hitting one city or one piece of infrastructure. It was about stressing multiple systems at once. In Kyiv, Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said 4 people were killed, including a 12-year-old child, and officials put the number of injured at 60. Klitschko described how one drone flew very low and slammed into an 18-story building early Thursday. He also said a mother and child were rescued from a building in a central district. Moreover, emergency services reported that 4 medical workers and 2 police officers were injured while responding to strike sites. In Odessa, officials said 8 people were killed and 26 were injured, with a high-rise residential building badly hit. The regional governor said port facilities and critical infrastructure were also damaged. In Dnipro, regional officials reported 4 killed and 30 injured, with residential buildings set ablaze, and another fatality reported in the surrounding region. So how exactly did Ukraine's defenses react to it? Ukraine says its defenses stopped most of what Russia threw at it. Out of the 703 detected aerial targets, Ukraine reported 31 missiles and 636 drones were shot down or neutralized. That's 667 out of 703, about 95% of the tracked threats. That number matters because it tells you the air defense network didn't collapse under volume. It stayed coordinated across multiple cities and across multiple waves, while the country was being hit in parallel. But it's also where people misread the story if they look only at the percentage. Because even a small share getting through becomes deadly when the volume is this high. And the 95% figure is not just a victory statistic. It is also a measure of how hard Ukraine had to work to keep the system intact. Reuters reported that 12 missiles and 20 drones still hit their targets. That is why this strike wave lands as a national event and not just another military statistic. IP's reporting further makes it blunt. Ukrainian officials say stocks of advanced interceptor missiles are under strain. They point to US-made Patriot systems as crucial against ballistic missiles, and they stress the need for more missiles to sustain this kind of defense. And that's where the air defense math becomes the real battleground. You can see the shape of Russia's intent in how this strike was built. Drones for volume, missiles for punch, waves to find seams. Because in a raid like this, drones aren't just weapons, they are decision points. Every time a blip enters the radar, someone has to decide what it is, where it is going, what it might be carrying, and whether it is worth spending to stop it. And that what it is worth spending question is where modern air defense gets dangerous, because it's not only tactical, it's economic. Patriot interceptors are expensive. Advanced missiles are finite. So in a raid like this, air defense stops being only a tactical problem. It becomes an inventory war. So Russia doesn't need one apocalyptic strike to win the air campaign. It just needs to keep the economic and logistical pressure on. While this strike wave was unfolding, President Volodymyr Zelensky was in the Netherlands, attending an event and using the moment to keep international support locked in. Reuters reported Zelensky accepted the International Four Freedoms Award in Middelburg and observed a moment of silence for victims of the overnight attacks. That contrast matters because it shows how Ukraine is being forced to fight 2 battles at once. One battle is in the sky. Intercept the wave, keep the network coordinated, keep cities functioning. The other battle is in the supply chain. Keep the pipeline alive so the next wave can be intercepted too. That is why Zelensky's travel isn't a side story. It is part of the same war, because air defense is inventory, and inventory is politics. You can see this in the language coming out of Kyiv after strikes like this. Reuters reported Zelensky called for aid and effective pressure on Russia, urging decisions that increase pressure and warning against delays. AP reported his argument that Russia does not deserve easing or sanction relief after nights like April 16th. This is not messaging for its own sake, it's operational. A sustained air defense campaign depends on the restock schedule behind it. Now, April 16th also didn't happen in isolation. It came on top of a tempo. On April 15th, Reuters reported Russia launched another major sequence, 324 drones and 3 ballistic missiles overnight, followed by 361 drones and 21 missiles during a subsequent 13-hour period. Ukraine said it intercepted most of those too, but some still struck multiple locations. So this was not a one-night spike. It was part of a tightening strike rhythm. And when rhythm tightens, the same defensive success starts costing more every day. More interceptors, more readiness, and more strain. Russia's tactic is to keep the defender paying for defense at a rate the defender can't sustain. Now, Ukraine's response to that pressure did not remain purely defensive. Reuters reported Ukraine struck oil depots in Russian-occupied Crimea and hit infrastructure in Russia's southern Black Sea port of Tuapse. This supports the deeper logic behind Ukraine's retaliation. It isn't just that they hit back because they were angry. It's because they wanted to damage the war machine. Fuel and infrastructure matter because modern war is not only fought by units at the front, it is funded and enabled by logistics. If Russia forces Ukraine to spend interceptors, Ukraine tries to force Russia to spend on protection, repair, dispersal, and defense of its own critical nodes. That's a cost of war layered on top of the strike war. Because if the war becomes an inventory contest, then production becomes a battlefield. This is where the Germany story matters. On April 14th, Reuters reported Germany and Ukraine signed defense cooperation accords in Berlin, including a joint drone production deal that Zelensky suggested could become one of the largest of its kind in Europe. Reuters also reported Germany's support includes financing US-made Patriot missiles and German-made IRIS-T launchers, and investment in Ukraine's longer-range strike capabilities. That is not just another aid package headline. It changes the geometry of the war, because if Russia can strike factories inside Ukraine, Ukraine has an incentive to push production outward, into partner countries, into co-production, into supply chains that can keep output moving even under bombardment. That's how you turn defense from an emergency into a replenishment cycle. And that replenishment cycle is what keeps 95% interception nights possible. Now, Ukraine has also been public about adapting its battlefield methods, not only its air defense. On April 15th, Reuters reported Ukraine described a new combat model, integrating drone warfare with infantry, creating drone assault units that combine unmanned aerial and ground systems with infantry into a single integrated system. Ukraine's commander said Russian-held areas were recaptured in March using this approach, alongside intensified fighting across the front. That matters here, because it shows Ukraine's response to pressure is not one-dimensional. It's an attempt to survive a long war by spreading the burden across systems rather than betting everything on one layer. Now Moscow can see that shift, and it has responded in a predictable way by warning Europe. On April 15th, Russia's defense ministry warned that European plans to increase drone production and supply to Ukraine were pulling European countries deeper into conflict. Moscow published addresses of facilities it claimed were involved in drone or drone component production. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev suggested those sites could become military targets depending on future developments. And the European response shows this wasn't shrugged off. On April 16th, Reuters reported the Czech Foreign Ministry summoned the Russian ambassador after Russian messaging, and lists of facilities were interpreted as threats against Czech companies. That's an escalation ladder of its own. Ukraine pushes production outward. Russia responds by naming industrial nodes as part of the risk map. European governments respond diplomatically, because now the war is touching their own industrial geography. This is what spillover looks like in a modern industrial contest. Not necessarily troops crossing borders, but pressure on supply lines, pressure on factories, pressure on political will, pressure on whether production continues. And this is exactly why April 16th matters beyond the death toll, because it is part of a system that pushes the war outward, from the air to inventory, from inventory to factories, and from factories to alliances. This brings us to the final layer, Europe's own defense acceleration. On April 16th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte agreed to work more closely to strengthen the EU-NATO relationship, with von der Leyen emphasizing the need to increase and accelerate investment and production in Europe's defense industry. That line is the clue. This isn't only about how much money is allocated. It's about output, how many systems can be produced, how fast, and how reliably. Because nights like April 16th don't just destroy buildings, they create a policy verdict that the current stockpile pace is not enough for the tempo of this war. Zelensky in Middelburg wasn't just receiving a peace award. He was pressing the argument that this is a sustained, systemic conflict, one that requires sustained, systemic support, because Ukraine's air defense is not a static wall, it's a living network. Russia's deadliest aerial attack of the year wasn't deadliest because Russia suddenly discovered one new weapon. It was deadliest because Russia applied a modern saturation template at scale. 2 waves, hundreds of drones, ballistic and cruise missiles spread across multiple key cities and systems. Ukraine's defenses didn't break. Ukraine says it neutralized roughly 95% of detected targets, but the remaining percentage still killed civilians, including a 12-year-old in Kiev, and injured more than 100 people across the country. That's the hard truth of this phase of the war. The defender can do a lot right and still pay a heavy price. And it's why AP's reporting about interceptor strain matters as much as Reuters reporting about casualties, because the question isn't whether Ukraine can intercept a big wave once. It's whether Ukraine can intercept the next one at the same rate, with the same inventory, under the same tempo. That is why the April 15th tempo matters, why the Germany production deal matters, why the Czech diplomatic response matters, and why EU-NATO industrial acceleration matters. They are all pieces of the same story. A war expanding into the supply chain. That's the story of April 16th. Not just tragedy, not just interception, but a war expanding into the supply chain. Because once a country is forced to intercept hundreds of threats in a single night, success stops meaning nothing got through. Success starts meaning the system still functions tomorrow, and still has enough left for the next wave. So what do you think happens next? Can Ukraine keep intercepting strike waves at this scale, or is Russia slowly turning this into a war of attrition that becomes harder to survive every week? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.